Hey guys, the second episode of The Chosen Season 3 has officially arrived on the new Chosen app, so it's time to break down episode 2 and recap exactly what happened. Before we get started, be sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on that notification bell so you know when more videos like this are coming. Also, I'd really appreciate it if you could give this video a like, because that lets YouTube know that videos like this are worth watching. Other than that, I hope y'all are having a wonderful Christmas season so far, and let's get to the episode recap. The episode kicks off with Gaius and Atticus talking about the new camp of pilgrims who've come to Capernaum to seek Jesus and how that might become a problem. Atticus can tell that something's distracting Gaius, and he tells him that secrets do tend to come out. He also tells Gaius that it's in his best interest to go tell Quintus about the shanty town before it becomes a bigger problem. Meanwhile, Simon, Z, and Nathaniel are walking through the encampment itself. Z is paranoid that if the pilgrims break the law, it'll bring undue attention to Jesus, but when he confronts the pilgrims, they can tell he and Nathaniel are disciples of Jesus and start questioning him, leaving Nathaniel smug at Z's failure. Some ominous guy watches them as they leave, and the camera pans to reveal a Sika dagger clenched in his hand. He's one of the zealots, too. We cut to the opening credits. After the credits, we pick up right where episode 1 left off, the reunion between Matthew and his parents. And all I've got to say about this scene is that I'm not crying, you're crying. Matthew explains that ever since Jesus' sermon, he knew he needed to try to reconcile with them. How can he ask God to forgive his debts when he owes such a massive debt to his parents? One illustration in particular stuck out to him above all the rest: the image of a man going to be reconciled to his brother before offering his gift at the altar. Matthew knows that he isn't a priest and that his parents aren't his brother, but it's the principle that matters, and he knows that he messed up. His father calls him out on wanting to be better than them, and though Elisheva tries to protest, Matthew actually agrees. He admits that he placed himself over his family and his friends and his faith, and that he wants to atone. Yet this is where it starts getting really good, because Alphaeus says that he needs to atone as well. Matthew was wrong for all the stuff that he'd done, but that didn't justify Alphaeus' response. He says he had no right to respond to Matthew as he did, because two wrongs don't make a right. On a personal note, I've got to say that I really appreciated the nuance and maturity that the writers of the show put into this interaction. It would have been so easy to make Matthew the only bad guy and to overlook Alphaeus' role in the conflict. I think that, even as Christians, sometimes we're so quick to cast the blame on others that we don't see the role that we may have played in the problems we face. In most Christian entertainment, conflicts are portrayed as black and white, good and bad guy scenarios that are devoid of any nuance or discernment, which doesn't really ring true to life. In this particular scenario, however, Matthew was definitely the guiltier of the two, but the nuance and wisdom that the showrunners put into the interactions such as this are, in my opinion, the thing which really set this show apart from any other Christian entertainment I've encountered. Anyways, back to the recap. Matthew asks what motivated the sudden change of heart, and they reveal that they were at the sermon too. They're thrilled that Matthew is functioning as his scribe, and whenever Elisheva comes in to give Matthew a hug, he actually sets his handkerchief down to hug her back. Matthew calls his parents Ima and Abba once again for the first time in a long time, and they give him back his old house key, repeating Gaius' words to them back at Matthew.
Give it away. Tear it down. Burn it if you want. Why would I do that?
Speaking of Gaius, him and Atticus walk into Quintus' quarters, where they encounter the Romans shouting at a servant concerning dirty water. After the servant leaves, Gaius mentions the pilgrim situation, and Quintus is ticked when he hears that it has to do with Jesus of Nazareth, who's continually being a thorn in his flesh. Interestingly, both Gaius and Atticus play down the sermon, most likely to buy themselves more time to discern where exactly they land with this Jesus guy. Rather than kicking out the pilgrims, Atticus suggests Quintus redraw the boundary lines to tax them and take advantage of their presence. Again, buying himself more time. But he convinces him not to be too harsh with the pilgrims either. After Gaius leaves, Atticus mentions paying Pontius Pilate a visit, leaving Quintus visibly nervous. Over in the Zebedee household, Thomas tries out a batch of Zebedee's olive oil and gives it his seal of approval. He tells them of his intentions to marry Rama, but this brings up an issue. It's customary to organize a proposal with one's father, but with his father being deceased and without any older brothers, Thomas doesn't have any male relatives to accompany him. They encourage him to seek Jesus' permission and blessing, and he tells them that after searching his heart, he knows this to be the right decision. Speaking of married couples, we cut to Simon and Eden, who are still struggling to find privacy now that Nathaniel and Z are staying with them. Simon walks behind Eden as she's kneading bread, and she asks if he's planning on being there the entire time, and he says yes. And she likes that answer. After explaining that the other guys need to do some studying, Simon says he needs to do some studying of his own, and they retreat into the bedroom. Gaius and another Roman named Julius make their way through Tent City. Gaius urges Julius not to be too harsh with the people there, but it's obvious that he's still distracted and doesn't really want to be there. Admitting this, Gaius excuses himself and he leaves. That night, Simon Z goes to get water from the local well, only to find that, just as we learned earlier with Quintus, the water is dirty. His zealot senses start tingling, and he realizes that he's being followed, leading him to flee and escape onto a roof through epic parkour moves, where he finds himself confronted by none other than Atticus. Z thinks that Atticus was coming for him, but Atticus reveals that he just wants to know more about Jesus.
What is he, Simon?
He says that he's just interested in seeing what happens next. He tells Z that he wasn't the one who chased him up onto the roof. There are zealots in the area, and he warns Z that they won't stop coming after him. We pick up with Simon and Eden after their foray into the bedroom. Eden tells Simon how glad she is to have him back and talks about how the one thing that kept her going in his absence was the reminder that Jesus gave her that he saw her and knew her struggle. She mentions that sometimes she feels like she's forgetting Jesus' face. Simon tells her that he thinks it's time for them to focus on starting a family, and I've got to say that I'm really excited to see what they do with the story arc because it looks like they've got a whole lot planned. At Mary Magdalene's place, the women are beginning to recognize that they're going to need to do something about their growing financial situation. Tamar starts acting strange and defensive, causing Mary and Rama to exchange curious looks at one another when Tamar rejects the idea of following their example and sacrificing any personal belongings in order to follow Jesus. Changing the subject, the women begin to tease Rama about Thomas, Tamar accusing Rama of being in love with him. Rama explains that that's not exactly how marriage works in Jewish culture, but that Tamar, being a Gentile, wouldn't understand. Tamar didn't seem to care too much for that comment, but she brushes it off and says, Jew, Gentile, love is love. This causes the women to ask Tamar more about her past once again, but once again, she gets defensive and reserved. Eventually, they get Rama to admit that, in her own way, she does love Thomas and is really excited about the idea of marrying him, which the women have reason to believe could be coming very, very soon. Jesus gathers the 12 together for a super important meeting. They are about to officially become the 12. Andrew asks if they're building an army. Jesus admits that that is one way of looking at it, but the other way is my way. He says that the people need rescue, but when Z begins to get excited, he explains that this is a different type of rescue than they might have in mind. Not from the Romans, but from something even greater. He's chosen the 12 of them as his apostles and is going to send them out in groups of 2 to spread his teachings while he goes back to spend time in his hometown of Nazareth. He's only sending them to their fellow Israelites, and he tasks them with proclaiming the kingdom and performing miracles. Simon, thinking of his wife, asks Jesus how soon they're talking. The rest of the group is obviously hyper-focused on something else, performing miracles. Jesus tells them that he's granted them his authority. Nathanael asks if he missed a ceremony, but Jesus explains that this meeting was the ceremony. Nathanael says he doesn't feel different, and Jesus explains that he doesn't need to feel different. John argues that they're barely students, much less equipped to go out and teach others, but Jesus responds that if he needed experts, he probably wouldn't have picked any of them to begin with, which is a fair point. He tells them to take nothing and charge nothing, just as they received freely from him. Thaddeus asks what they're supposed to teach, and Jesus tells them to teach everything they've heard. Judas points out he's only heard one sermon, but Nathanael impulsively remarks that this was the best of the bunch. Jesus clarifies that the miracles aren't without purpose, but they're specifically meant to prove his ministry. Andrew asks what to do if things turn sour like they did with John the Baptist, and Jesus tells them they don't need to fear the one who kills the body. He affirms that persecution will come for them, and it will be severe, severe persecution indeed. But that they don't have to worry about that for this trip. On this trip, at least, they'll be fairly safe. They might face some pushback, but it won't be nearly severe, and it won't cost them their life this time. He explains that Matthew has donated his former house to the women as headquarters, and when the group starts bickering, Simon orders them to calm down. Judas offers to help them with generating income, but Jesus says that he wants them to rely on God and others, not on money.
This is what it means to follow and to lead.
While Simon agrees, he mentions that Judas did make a fair point and that they will need someone to manage their money. Philip nominates Matthew for the task, and Simon even agrees that Matthew would best be suited for it, which is a really groundbreaking moment. But Matthew turns the job down, asserting that he doesn't want to associate himself with money anymore after his past job as a tax collector. He nominates Judas instead, and Judas accepts the job as the group treasurer going forward. Jesus separates them into groups.
Simon and Judas, north to Caesarea Philippi. Andrew and Philip, east to Nauvoo. Nathanael and Thad, South to Perea, John and Thomas. Southwest to Joppa, Big James and Little James. West to the plains of Sharon, Matthew and Z. All the way down to Jericho.
Somehow Z had miraculously gone all this time without knowing that Matthew was a tax collector. Not totally sure how he pulled that off, given all the way that they've interacted with Matthew throughout this entire thing and all the discussions they've had. But whenever the group begins to protest at the idea of a zealot traveling with a tax collector, Jesus reminds them that none of them are what they were, and that they'll actually do and say great things because of their pasts, not in spite of them. After the meeting, Simon immediately rushes over to Eden, who explains that she needs space. Thomas asks Jesus for his blessing to marry Ramah, and Jesus explains that one of the reasons he chose to send him and John south to Joppa was so he could visit Ramah's father after completing the first part of their mission. He reminds Thomas that Ramah's father isn't a believer and suggests that he put in a good word for Jesus while he makes a pitch for himself. As Thomas leaves, he encounters Ramah just outside the house, and the two admit their feelings for one another. Ramah says she wants to be involved in the courtship process, which is pretty different given cultural standards at that time. He says that he's more than happy to do it alone, but she insists that she wants the trip to be successful, so he happily agrees. Little James comes up to Jesus, voicing his confusion over the fact that he is going to be healing others while he himself hasn't been healed. Jesus asks James if he wants to be healed, and when James asks why Jesus hasn't healed him, he explains that it's because he trusts him. He tells James to listen closely and says that, according to the Father's will, he could heal James right here and now. And if he did so, James would have a good story to tell. But it's a story just like all those others who had been healed. However, Jesus has a better story planned for James. The testimony of praising God in spite of his pain. Jesus is fully aware of the fact that many people come to him purely because of his healing ministry. But he points out that James came to him in spite of not being healed. James came to Jesus because of Jesus. To show patience on earth would be a marvelous and powerful testimony to the kingdom, and Jesus tells James that he and his father entrust few people with such a difficult and arduous task. James says that others are better than him, but Jesus rebukes him and says to never say such nonsense again. He says that God doesn't care about people looking impressive, but that the things that God does care about, James has. He tells James that he will one day be healed in eternity and charges him to find strength in spite of his weakness, and James willingly submits and simply says,
"Thank you, Master."
Jesus once again affirms that he will one day be healed. Later that night, Matthew walks through the city past his old tax booth into the house he once called home. He finds Gaius, who claims to have been set to patrol that area. The two are happy to see each other, with both of them looking more at ease in each other's presence than they have been in a long while. Matthew explains that some of his friends are going to be staying there, and Gaius says that if they're friends of Matthew, then he'll make sure to patrol the area and preserve the peace. When the other 11 arrive, Gaius departs. Matthew welcomes them all to his home, but before they go in, Simon gathers everyone together for a pep talk. They admit that they're scared to go on the trip, but Philip, calling upon his experience with John the Baptist, assures them that it's scary when you upset powerful people, but worth it. Simon ensures that Z will be good with Matthew, and they gather in one big circle, each standing with their partners. Simon leads them in Psalm 3, and as they collectively call upon God to provide them strength for their mission, the scene cuts to black. After having seen it a few times, I've got to say that I like this episode even more than episode 1. It has a more cohesive structure, it addresses certain topics and themes I'm super passionate about, and it included some of the best acted and emotional scenes that we've had thus far in the show. The scenes between Matthew and his parents at the beginning and little James and Jesus at the end were definitely highlights, with Paris Patel and Jordan Ross giving scene-stealing performances. Paris always does such a good job at nuancing Matthew's character and making his growth feel organic and real, which I imagine can't be easy with a show like this where scenes and episodes are shot in different orders than the actual plots play out. I love the camera focusing in on him placing the handkerchief down whenever he went to give a hug to his mother, and the little smile he gives whenever he sees Gaius at the end of the episode standing outside his house genuinely feels like a person seeing his long-lost friend for the first time in a long while, so I thought that was all really, really well done. As for Jordan, he brings so much weight and tenderness to the character of little James, and that entire scene outside Simon's house was masterfully acted. You've got to also give credit to Jonathan Roumie for delivering those difficult yet loving truths to little James's character. rebuking and encouraging and even depending upon James all at the same time. I thought that was all really well done. And also the personal nature of that story for the actor Jordan Ross also just enhances it even more whenever you know that backstory. The whole scene addresses a situation we never actually see played out in the Bible, but I think the writers did such an expert job at scripting the interaction that it really does play out like a conversation I could imagine the genuine Jesus having with someone. I know a lot of people won't like it because they'll disagree with the theology of the scene, and while I know where those people are coming from, and I can understand why they might be so quick to jump to their conclusions, I personally don't think anything communicated in this scene is contrary to biblical doctrine, and I think it's actually very discerning and tactful in the way that they address such a sensitive issue. While the little James scene is probably my favorite individual scene in the episode, my favorite segment is without a doubt the extended section of Jesus appointing the 12, mainly because I've done a lot of research in the Gospels and on the 12 apostles, and this is a scene I've been waiting for ever since the show began. The scene itself is adapted from scripture in a really well done way, but I think my favorite part is actually the little principles of discipleship that we have littered throughout that scene, which kind of serve as the explanations that the writers give for why Jesus gave the instructions that he gave in the Bible. Those explanations are obviously extra biblical, but the principles were consistent with Christ's character and with biblical doctrine, and as someone who is super passionate about discipleship, I just loved to see it. That being said, what did you think about The Chosen Season 3, Episode 2? Let me know the positives, the negatives, and the in-betweens in the comment section down below, and just to throw some controversy in there, let me know whether or not you agree that there were some people that Jesus didn't heal. Like I said, I have a whole lot of Chosen-related content planned out for y'all in the coming weeks and months, so be sure to hit the subscribe button and notification bell so you know when those things are coming at you. Until then, I'm David Tate, and this is Now Let's Be Honest. Be sure to keep a smile on your face, and don't let anybody steal your joy. Talk to y'all later.
You read a verse, you sing a hymn, the money's in the plate. Sundays you mark out for him, but even then you show up late. You bought the shirt, you wear the cross, but sin throughout the week. 30 shekels and a noose, you kiss him on the cheek.